All right. Psalm 71, let's use 4 as the theme for this week's set of lessons, entitled this one, Forever, even though continually is going to be the word that seems to come up at least 3 times in this psalm, which may be penned by David, but the unnamed psalmist is going to talk about the way in which, once again, even though he is going through it, he is going to find reasons to continually trust that God will get him through this time, as he's done in the past. As in verses 1 through 4, he is going to offer up a prayer asking God to rescue him from a wicked enemy, an unjust and cruel man. Later on, we're going to find out that it is not just one man or a single enemy, but in this first 4 verses, he's going to say, I continually come to you for refuge. As in verses 5 through 11, he is going to ask God to rescue him for he's basically hoped in God or trusted in God from the time he was a youth. And so he's going to ask God, going into my old age, please don't forsake me now, understanding that I've trusted in you for so long. And the first thing we might understand is that as we age, the enemies don't necessarily get any less vicious, because over and over, at least twice in this passage, it's going to basically say that he is facing a uniquely cruel enemy. But in the next set of verses, verses 12 and 13, he is going to again ask God to hurry and haste, because he is dealing with a set of accusers, once again, as we mentioned, that are uniquely cruel. And so he is going to ask God to shame them or embarrass them, much in the same way that they are looking to pile on harm to him, as he'll go on in verses 14 through 24 to bring up that theme again. Look, I have trusted in you from the time of my youth. Therefore, God, please allow me once again to sing of your salvation and tell others about the way that you don't just get the young out of a bind, the way that you can still save an old man. And in this particular chapter, one of the things that caught my attention beyond the theme forever or continually is the mistake that the enemy is going to make in this chapter. Is he is going to describe the enemy in a number of ways that I think might merit some attention. In verse 4, we've already mentioned, he describes him as a wicked, unjust, and cruel enemy. In verse 10, he's going to describe them as consulting together. And in verse 11, he's going to say, they will assume that God has forsaken him, therefore pursue and seize him, for there is none to deliver. And in previous lessons, we have talked about how we and our adversaries can get caught up in the temptation to do bad math, going all the way back to the book of Joshua, when Israel assumed because of their victory at Jericho, they were going to just go and take the smaller town of Ai. They did bad math, but in the same way, they were presumptuous in doing the bad math, assuming that a smaller city would be an easier objective. Ai ended up making the same mistake, and that ended up being the way that God eventually delivered Israel into a victory over Ai, because they were just as presumptuous as Israel was, just in a different way. Israel presumed that a smaller city would be an easier victory. Ai presumed that just because they had beaten Israel the day before, that they were just going to walk in and beat them again, or actually walk out, since they were defending their city. They came out presumptuously, thinking that they would win just as they had before, only to have God deliver them over to defeat. In this particular chapter, we seem to be looking at an enemy that, one, is unjust, meaning they don't believe that the rules apply to them the same way that other people might have a conscience that stops them from taking certain actions. And so certain enemies look at their lack of a conscience as an advantage in battle, meaning they don't have the inhibitions that others might have. It's bad math. Likewise, they might make too much of the fact that they seem to have the psalmist, quite possibly David, outnumbered. However, that would be a dangerous assumption, because even though they might have the numbers, they might not have the inhibitions of a functioning conscience or anything that seems to be standing in the way of them doing whatever they want to the psalmist, understanding that it seems like God is not standing up for the psalmist the way he might have in the past. Those 3 things aren't enough. Actually, they're going to amount to, as we mentioned, bad math, because the psalmist, in saying, I will continually trust in God, understands the only math that matters is whether or not God, no matter how bad it looks, is still willing to defend him. And so much like Moses realized that it wasn't necessarily the size or the tactical advantages of the Egyptian army that mattered, and likewise, like Hezekiah seemed to also realize that it wasn't the size or the tactical advantages of the Assyrian army that mattered as much as whether they continually sought to understand what God wanted in this situation. And so my prayer for you is my prayer for me, that we continually draw closer to God in a way that would persuade him to show us opportunities, even as our enemies might be doing bad math.